A learning aid is a document designed to improve the performance of a student or an employee who's trying to complete a very specific task. Typically in the corporate world, designers call these things job aids or sometimes performance support documents. Regardless, they're supposed to be available on demand so that they can be used just in time when they're needed, instead of having the learner actually go through some kind of formal course where it's formally taught. In this presentation, I want to show you how we can apply a very popular framework to help us build better just-in-time learning aids. The model is based on Ruth Clark's research, which has examined extensively how visual design impacts learning and performance. And by the way, she's a colleague of Richard Mayer, so much of her model should feel very familiar to you. Ultimately, what I think you're going to get out of this are some very specific design tips on how you can improve the text and graphic elements in your learning aids. First though, let's go ahead and start with the instructional design context, because sometimes learners don't really need a formal course, especially when the target content is very specific, such as how to store lab materials safely, or which form should I fill out for graduation, or how do I log in to get to the new student information portal. Sometimes these types of logistical information needs can best be served by a learning aid. And sometimes the needs are more curricular, and we'll see some of those distinctions as we move through this. So is a formal course needed? If it's not, a learning aid may be sufficient. In many cases, a standalone static document is all that you need. The great thing about learning aids, though, is that if they're designed well, they can also be integrated into other systems. Now, what is a learning aid? You might be thinking, well, it's similar to an infographic in that it has relevant graphics and text, but the text tends to be much more detailed. So there's quite a bit more text there. And another key distinction is we don't just make them in Photoshop. We typically start in Photoshop because we have to build the graphics there initially, and there is some compositing that we do like we've learned previously. But inevitably at some point, we have to take the graphic that we build and we import it into some type of authoring application. And there are lots of different authoring applications that could do this. It could be a desktop publishing application like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Publisher. It could be a presentation program like PowerPoint or Keynote, or another any number of different proprietary applications can do this. Or simply a web editor, or it could be just a text editor and we're writing raw HTML. Either way, the format that we end up exporting that combines the graphic with the text is typically saved as either a PDF file or as an HTML document. And the great thing about those two particular formats is that they're completely standalone and they can be ingested in a lot of different platforms that we can use for implementation. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. One of the principal questions that Ruth Clark asks in a lot of her research is, how can we visualize learning content? And the answer, as she's discovered in a lot of the evidence-based scholarship that she's produced, is that it depends on what you're teaching. How you visualize it totally depends on what the actual content is. Are you teaching facts? Are you teaching concepts? Are you teaching procedures or processes? Well, depending on what you're teaching, that will determine then to a large extent how you end up visualizing that information. So we're going to break these down, each of these four categories. There are actually other categories, but these are the ones that I think are most relevant to what we tend to do. And let's go ahead and start just with facts. Here's what she says about visualizing facts. It's really important to display representational graphics, and what she means by that is a photo or a shape or a combination thereof that is presented in context to whatever it is that you're trying to learn. And I'm going to show you some examples here in just a second. She's also going to suggest that we keep the content, specifically the text and the graphics, very close to each other, and that makes a lot of sense. This sounds like Robin Williams and her principle of proximity. So spatial contiguity, again, you should be thinking Mayer here. Yeah, keep your stuff together. Captions should be really close to their photos. This is a very basic concept, but it's something that pervades a lot of her research. She also mentions that it's really important to use organizers, and organizers are these visual tricks and shapes and objects and strategies that we can implement to try to help the eye move through the page. And we'll take a look at some examples. So let's take a look at this historical fact that we're teaching here. This is about the first expedition to Mount Everest, where they actually reached the top. And you can see how the route is actually traced up the mountain here. And you have stops here every now and then with some text elements inside these containing boxes that explain what happened at each particular step. You also have a vertical timeline here and some factoids in the right-hand side, and then there's a chart down here at the bottom. And of course we have this kind of representational graphic right here. This is obviously one of the expeditioners, and then of course you could say that the mountain itself is a representational graphic, because that's what we're studying here, is this entire expedition. So that's what she means by representational. It's a very literal representation of what it is that we're trying to learn. So here's another example that might make this a little bit easier to understand. Here's an instructional learning aid about oil imports. Now when you first see this, you might pick up immediately on the nice color scheme that they've got going here, very dominant blue color, etc. But that's not what we want to focus on here. What you want to look at are the different kinds of elements that we've got set up here. We've got a title element, we've got some subtext here, we have a key graphic representation, a representational graphic right here, and if you're careful, you'll notice that, oh wow, these are barrels of oil. So very literally, again, we're representing the content in a way that's easy for learners to understand. She also thinks it's sometimes a good idea when we're teaching facts to include some type of relational data, charts and graphics. It's charts and graphs, for example, that allow learners to understand certain statistics relevant to the information that is presented. And then we have some supplemental text and shape items underneath each particular graphic here. And again, the principle of contiguity or spatial contiguity here is very evident. These explanatory text elements are located right underneath the corresponding graphic. And that's not coincidence, that is good design. Her next category is concepts, and to visualize concepts well in a learning aid, she says you should begin at least with some type of definition, and then you should provide some examples. Spatial contiguity continues to be important, as do organizers. These visual organizers in particular help learners understand distinctions and help build these mental models, and this is easier to understand if we simply look at an example. So in this particular example here, this should be something that hits home for all of us. This is driver's ed. What do we see here? Well, we've got some text elements up at the top, followed by a graphic, a representational graphic, a very simplified graphic, by the way, that demonstrates what's happening here. We even have a little bit of signaling here with the arrows pointing the direction of the movement and the direction of the action. And then we have an illustration down here at the bottom with its text sort of near it. I wouldn't call this a great example, but it's worth mentioning here. A better example, I think, can be seen right here, not just because it has pretty colors and complementary colors, but because, at least according to the criteria that Clark sets out, it begins with a definition up here at the top. So if we're trying to learn about the concept of reverse mortgage, what is that? It starts up with a definition at the top. And then we work in kind of this zigzag fashion, going left to right, bouncing down the page, following these visual organizers. What are the organizers that are being used? Well, they're containment shapes. And they're very subtle. It's a very light-shaped rectangle here, and of course the title has a header background color. In this case, it's this shade of green. We have others down below where it changes colors, but it's repeated. So again, we should be thinking about Robin Williams' CRAP principles here also. But the simple point is, in this particular learning aid, it's this combination of shapes, graphics, and text in a meaningful way. And because of spatial contiguity, the proximity of these elements placed closely together, we've reduced the cognitive load that's required to understand what's going on this page. You got one element up at the top, you got one combined element here, you've got one combined element right there, and that image even has these little lines that connect to it. So this is all one item. And then we have another item right here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 main items, and then we got a little orphan standing over here. The only thing I don't like in this design are these check marks. I don't think they really add much to this. They look like filler content. We shouldn't be scared of white space, and Robin Williams did a good job explaining that to us. So consider that a non-example in this example. Let's switch over to procedures now. If you're trying to teach a procedure, she thinks it's a very good idea that you don't use representational graphics. You use what she calls transformational graphics. And these are really easy to understand. All they are representational graphics that change over time. You get to see a series of changes in states of the actual graphic. And again, this will make sense when we show you some examples here. There are also ample use of graphic cues throughout. And of course, we continue with more spatial contiguity. So take a look at an example here, and I think that might be helpful. We see this in a lot of stepwise software tutorials. And in this particular example here, you can see we've got a screenshot right here, and then we have some detailed text explaining what's happening in that particular screenshot, and then the same thing down below. And what's interesting about this particular design is that this is really a two-page learning aid. We start with one screen per page, some text describing what's going on, and that's it. There's not really a whole lot of directional cueing or other signaling that's happening inside of this. We just kind of read the narrative, and we have the associated screen, and we're supposed to look over here and make sense of what we're reading accordingly. I don't think this is always the most effective design. This certainly looks pretty because we have this nice complementary color scheme, and there's ample use of white space, and spatial contiguity is very proximal here. It looks nice, but sometimes I don't think that's the most effective way to teach software skills or how to use a particular application. In other instances, here's another way to take these graphics and show them in a transformational way. And this may look a little cluttered to you, and it is, and I would criticize that and say that that's a liability in this particular design. But what I like about this design is that it's very clear to see the actual graphic transform. For example, up here at the top, this is in linear sequence the first screen in this tutorial document that you would interact with, or actually this isn't interactive. You would simply look at this and you see these lines that point to the different parts of the interface explaining what you do. And then in the next step, we have a cutout version here of just a little bit of that screenshot and more text describing what the next phase is. And then down here, the graphic transforms again as a result of whatever it was you clicked up in this particular step. So the sequence here from top to bottom and kind of layering these pieces of the screenshots on top of each other is a very nice way in one page to show a process, or excuse me, a software procedure that's being demonstrated. And I think that works pretty well. Here's another technique using a combination of callouts and enumeration. In this case, we have one page or one screenshot here, and then we have these callouts and little text boxes that point to particular areas. And then over here on the right-hand side, we have numbers and their corresponding click on the actual screenshot. And this is useful if most of the clicks are taking place on one page and the page doesn't change a whole lot. So we don't see a transformational graphic in this case. What we see is this linear progression that's enumerated so that we can understand what happens or what we actually have to do to make the software operate the way we're being trained. In this example here, you see more obvious transformation. We have photos this time. In this case, this is some type of user manual where we're learning the procedure to make an upgrade here. And we've got step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. And so these images transform as the task evolves. And then we have detailed text over here on the right-hand side. I don't really like all this white space right here. That seems kind of orphan this particular two sets of text down here, or two sets of lines down here. But other than that, I think this is a pretty effective document. More transformational text, or excuse me, transformational graphics here. We start at the top. This, of course, is a learning aid about CPR. And a great use of contiguity here. We've got the image, and then we have a line that connects literally to the header, then it's enumerated, and then we have some text that describes what's going on, how we do this particular first part of the step. And then it continues following the same pattern down below. There's the next image, the text, the next image, the text. So a very linear fashion, and again, the graphics transform as we go through the particular process. This can be very, very effective. I called it a process. I should have said procedure. This can be a very, very effective way to visualize complex procedures. Break them up into parts, come up with these significant transformational graphics, and then annotate them with appropriate text that's placed close enough to the image so it's obvious that that text refers to that particular image. Similar to a procedure, Clark also says that transformational graphics are really important in a process when you're trying to visualize a process. But one key difference is the graphics need to be simplified, typically because the process may refer to something that's very complex. So we don't always see photos in process documents. Instead, we might see an illustration because that allows the author to simplify what's being visualized here. And once again, contiguity and graphic cues are very common, so let's take a look at a couple examples here. So if we're trying to learn here about lunar eclipses, not just the concept of what a lunar eclipse is, but the actual process. Remember, Clark said that for processes and for procedures, seeing the state change in a particular graphic over time, that transformation, is what's really, really important. So if we look very carefully in this example here, we can see how there's the moon going around the earth, there's the sun, and we can see how it changes. These little moon graphics change depending on its position here. And that's incredibly important for the type of content that we're trying to learn. We also have some enumeration here and some of these text callouts, and it's all wrapped up in a nice color scheme. We have great use of negative space here to pull the eye downward. I think this is a very visually appealing document, but it's this transformational change here in these documents. We see this series of changes here. That's what's really important for teaching a process or a procedure. Here's another example. Let's say we're trying to figure out how tsunamis form, not just what a tsunami is, but actually how they form. Where are the transformational graphics? Well, here they are right here. We have the rupture in the seabed, and then the upwelling, and then the wave forms and the wave travels. So this is, again, a series of transformations between these graphics that as they move along in time. So we're teaching this particular process using not just a combination of graphics and text, but also these transformational graphics that show changes in states over time. So those are some examples of learning aids that instructional developers often create. Whether you work in a classroom or a corporate training center, learning aids can be valuable on-demand instructional resources, and given their standalone, self-contained design, they can easily be integrated into more complex learning objects, modules, courses, etc. if you end up needing formal instruction. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's this simple granularity that makes them so incredibly useful. A little detailed text, some relevant graphics, and then you save them in a format that works independently, like PDF or HTML. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you online.